me trying to find a pathway for different ways that I can get involved with agroforestry and how I've kind of got there so far. So I can go on to this. At the moment, I'm working full-time at Schumacher College. I work there as, well, my job description is Agroforestry Nursery Coordinator. But yeah, so at Schumacher we have a 5-acre field in which we are using to kind of demonstrate different forms of agroforestry, because we run a horticulture programme, and so part of this is kind of for education, but also we're trying to produce as much food as possible for the college kitchens. So here you can see we have some fruit trees and vegetable alley cropping, and so that's mostly apples and plums. And then we have another area at the moment which we have chickens, and we've planted 60 sweet chestnut trees in amongst it. And at some point we hope that this will be able to evolve into a very nice habitat for the chickens to forage in, and they can have a role in managing the pests, and we'll use the sweet chestnut trees for nut production. That's our plan. And my particular role there at the moment has been to establish a tree nursery, and part of this was to try and generate an income source for the work at the college, because although we have students coming through and we grow a lot of food for the kitchens, at the moment, you know, the gardens are a kind of a financial deficit if we include the wages. And so it was kind of to experiment with having a small business that could potentially be a source of income to try and support the rest of the horticulture work that's happening there. And we also have a kind of an area of more complex polyculture in our forest garden, where we've tried to do things like, we have an area which is dedicated to produce herbal teas, and an area where we're producing perennial salads to help fill the hungry gap period, where we've struggled to produce annual salads to fill that gap. So that's kind of an overview of some of the stuff that's happening at Schumacher. I was going to look at new opportunities that I've found that I'm interested in getting involved in agroforestry, in kind of in 3 angles. One area that I'm particularly interested in is in nut crops. I kind of first got interested in looking at kind of tree crops from an edible perspective, and nuts came up quite quickly in terms of their ability to provide quite high calorie crops, and kind of the different sustainability prospects that growing nut trees could offer. And so I went and I trained with Fruit and Nut Ireland, which is kind of Ireland's kind of leading research centre looking at developing different temperate nut species. And they've been involved a lot in using nut trees and incorporating them into agroforestry plantings, which are happening in Ireland at the moment. And so the nut trees which are probably most suited to kind of the temperate area that we are in are things like walnut, sweet chestnut and kind of cob nuts. And I think that kind of nut trees are particularly good in terms of thinking ahead with the climate changes which are going to be happening. I mean, anyone who had walnut trees this year might have noticed it was a particularly good year for walnuts, with the drought summer. So in many ways, with the climate becoming more variable, whether that's wetter in the west or drier in the east, having trees with deep perennial root systems that can kind of buffer those changes a bit better might help fill in gaps when annual crops could be less successful in that year. And especially having tree crops which have high calorie and potentially high market value, they could really help fill in gaps where, if there were years where there were more annual crop failures. And also, you know, there's kind of the nutritional argument that they kind of are providing something that is often quite hard to get from land, especially in the UK, high protein, high oil crops, and it's something that at the moment we import a lot of, and there was not much of domestic production. And so I think nut crops and agroforestry, kind of some of the challenges that we're kind of having them is that, you know, nut crops, again, we've talked a lot about the slow lead time. You're planting a tree, you know, it's not going to, even if it's a grafted cultivar that's been developed to have kind of come into production as early as possible, the kind of the shortest yield times are still, you're going to be expecting kind of 8 years before you're getting decent crops for things like walnuts and sweet chestnuts. And even then it's very small up until the kind of 20-25 year. And so including them into agroforestry systems means that whatever the agri part of the system is can be providing a yield in the run-up whilst the trees are getting going. And I think there is a lot of very short-term thinking in terms of food growing. And in forestry, people plant trees and don't expect to have their timber yield until quite a lot way down the line. And if we're having nut trees that we're planting now, yes, in 25 years they may start reaching their peak, but they can carry on going for another 100 years after that. And so it's kind of thinking about potentially building in resilience into the future, especially if the climate is changing, but making them more favourable. and so now is a good time to be planting them. And then the other thing that's often quite challenging with growing nut trees and incorporating them at the moment is they're very expensive to source, especially if you're going for the grafted varieties. And so I kind of actually have seen this as an opportunity. So we can go on. And so I think places like where I've been working the tree nursery in Ireland, at the moment they can't quite meet the supply of the demand for certain groups of trees that they are supplying. At the moment, the place where I was working, they buy wholesale things like cob nuts in from Netherlands, and then they sell them on. But they've been capped on the number that they can buy of 3-year-old cob nuts because there's too much demand in Europe for trees. And so they're having to turn down people who want to buy 3-year-old cob nuts because there's not enough. And so this kind of led to them thinking, okay, well, we're going to have to try and grow some more of our own trees. And so another kind of benefit of doing the kind of the nursery work side of things is that they were finding that a lot of the trees they were buying in are grown in very chemically intensive environments. And as a result, the trees that they were getting had very poor root development, and they didn't have nice root hairs. And also, they were buying 3-year-old trees that had never been trained in the way that they wanted them trained. So for cob nut production, they wanted single leader trees that could then be grown on, and they were getting 3-year-old trees which already had lots of branching, and so there was kind of wasted growth there. And so I've been commissioned at Schumacher to grow on 3,000 cob nuts this year, and it'll be 3,000 again next year. And he's worked out the economics of it for in Ireland, and so all my role is I basically babysit the trees. So I've received them as tiny sticks with very small amounts of root on, planted them out in rows to kind of keep them alive, which was a little bit challenging. It was a very dry summer, hence we kind of tucked them in with Mypex to try and reduce the evaporation. But they did okay.
So you don't do it from the nut itself?
No.
Could you?
Not if you wanted a named cultivar for production. So if you grow a seedling hazelnut, the odds are you're probably going to get something that won't produce many nuts, whilst ones have been selectively developed and are therefore cloned from that point onwards for better nut production. And so the ones that we are all growing are ones which the guy in Ireland has selected to be very high yielding for nuts.
What sort of cloning does he do with them?
What sort of
cloning is it? Is it just vegetative propagation?
This is through stooling. So they'd basically you plant a tree, you cut it down.
So you can do the same from whatever you bought this year. You can stool them.
At some point I would like to, but there's a kind of a challenge with the stooling thing in terms of you've got to be in a place for a time and you've got to set up the beds and there's a slow lead time on doing it. So at the moment we're just being the middleman growing it on. But I mean, the opportunity for us has come up because of this demand for the nursery work. Schumacher College is being paid £1,000, pretty much, and we get all the material costs covered for. And this is from an area of 20 metres by kind of 15 metres, so it's actually quite a high value outlet compared to some of the other vegetables. And we're going to incorporate it into our vegetable rotation anyway. So now we've got the ground prepared, and at some point we could grow the cob nuts somewhere else. And so, from a kind of a new person coming into it and trying to get involved with trees, the actual growing of the trees is quite a good opportunity, and because trees are quite high value products. And actually some of my trees, this is an example of trees that he's supplied, and this is the planting in Ireland of a civil pastoral system. So you can see there's some cob nuts there, and they are normally grazed by sheep, but I think that was just cut slightly later in the season. But basically 500 of the trees that I've grown on this year are going straight to this project to expand their cob nut planting. So it's quite nice to be able to follow it through.
What's the alley width in this one? Do you know?
I think it's 4.5 metres.
In the alleys?
Yeah, it's 4.5 metre grid.
Oh, right, okay.
I think that's what they tend to use for cob nuts. Yes. And so part of this is kind of, I personally want to be able to grow my own trees, but as a new entrant, I don't have access to land and I can't afford to buy land. And looking at the costings of being able to try and grow some of these slow growing nut crops, I wouldn't be able to afford the capital to necessarily buy the land. And so I was looking at other models that I could potentially grow trees myself. And so this is when, this is the kind of Dartington thing that Harriet was talking about earlier. So they've got a bit of land and they have the landowner Dartington who has the tenant farmer, and then the farm, the tree alley strips have been sublet to different businesses. So Luscombe Drinks are managing the elderflower section, Huxton's Cross are managing the apple section, and then there's the kind of combination of people managing the the spice crop alleys. And so I kind of thought, actually, this is a really good model for a young person like me who kind of wants to be able to grow trees and wants to be able to have a way of managing some land, but I can't actually afford land, and a standard agricultural tenancy won't work for planting trees because of the kind of short lead times on it. And so I've kind of been looking out there, and because I've been able to propagate my own trees, I've kind of had one of the expenses that people often buy into, you know, not being able to afford the trees, I've kind of been able to bypass that. So I've got my trees. So I've got my 90 grafted walnuts that I want to plant out. And so I kind of did a call out for someone that I could negotiate with and manage kind of in an agroforestry system and plant my 90 walnuts. And so, we can go on to the next one. These aren't actually my walnuts, but this is what I will be doing. This is back in example in Ireland where we kind of the fruit and nuts applied the trees, and this is the walnut trees are 6 years in this now.
And what sort of soil is that?
It's North County Dublin. I don't know the soil type personally.
No, I mean, but is it underlying chalk or?
I wouldn't have thought it's chalk. No. I mean, I've come to an agreement with a landowner in Exeter, and he has a field which is currently just grazed by sheep, but he's interested in looking at some pasture as a system. And so we've come up with a contract where I will have a lease on planting 90 trees for 25 years. And so I'm going to plant them this kind of winter season, and I will protect them probably in something similar to what they've done there. And we'll kind of carry on, so the sheep will maintain the grasslands and graze, and hopefully as the walnut trees grow, I'll be able to manage them, and the sheep will do the kind of grass cover for me.
And what spacing are you going to do for your walnuts on?
12-metre grid.
12
Yeah, and I've sourced 20 different walnut varieties, so I've got pretty much anything I can get my hands on.
They're all nuts rather than timber, right?
They're all grafted trees that I will use for nuts. So yeah, quite a lot of them are French, some are from Eastern Europe, some American, and then there's a few odd ones which are from like Germany and other places. But yeah, so that's kind of how I've tried to kind of make myself a way into agroforestry, kind of starting from horticulture and working my way that way.
What are diseases that what you worry about?
What, for walnuts?
Or any,
Walnuts, especially in the west of the country, there's a walnut blight and another fungal one, walnut anthracnose, which I can't say, which I've just kind of fudged a name up there. But I think is it anthracnose? Anthracnose, okay. And they're both fungal diseases, which is kind of why often walnuts growing in wet areas is a challenge. But I've tried to deliberately select cultivars which have been demonstrated to have resistance to both of these. And that's kind of based on what Martin Crawford has said, and what, especially where they've been growing walnuts in Ireland, they've been growing them in areas which have double the rainfall that I will be having on my new site successfully. So I feel confident I can.
They need good drainage.
Yeah, free draining soil, deep soil preferably. And you can kind of work, slightly acidic, preferably.
Never mind disease, what about the squirrels?
What about the squirrels? That always comes up,
We
yes.
we
Yeah.
got walnuts, but we no longer get any
Yeah.
nuts because the squirrels have had them.
I think a lot of it's to do with site
That's
selection.
on the farm with
Yeah.
several miles of hedges and a lot of hazelnut.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of nuts.
Yeah,
I do like walnuts.
but it's also, where I'm going to be planting is in the middle of a block of arable land. There is no tree, no hedge, nothing in around it. And there has been research done that shows that squirrels don't like running across open land, especially if it's maintained short. Also, there has been kind of lots of people are suggesting more management of kind of squirrel populations as a kind of potential control in the future.
Definitely put it down.
Yeah. And there is also in the States, they have actually developed an electric fencing system for pine martens. And I have been talking with the people who have developed this. It's kind of a positive, negative wire stranding system, because obviously if they're climbing, you have to be able to have them to touch the earth and the kind of electric one at the same time. And there are some kind of people trialling this as a potential method of, if you have arable land, having a solid chicken wire fence up to kind of 120, and that's the limit at which they can jump, and then having this positive, negative strand around the edge. After the implementation costs, the maintenance costs of keeping it going would be quite low. And I haven't been involved with trials or anything, but I think it is interesting. And I think it's worth,
So you want to keep the pine martens out?
No,
Or
this is
you wanna,
from.
you want to keep the pine martens in. So
Yeah, no.
The pine martens
the
aren't
electric
involved in
fence.
what you're talking
No,
about.
it's fine.
Fence.
The electric fencing has been developed
I
to
was
keep
thinking,
pine martens out
surely you're not
of
allowed
chicken
to do that, yeah.
systems in the
Yeah.
States.
Okay, I
But there's a
understand.
similar physiology between the squirrel
If
and
you
the
could
pine
get pine
marten.
martens into your field and then fence them in, you'd be laughing.
That would be the other option.
Oh, I love that picture.
But anyway,
There's
yeah.
a working fencing system like that at Canalside CSA.
And I think, yeah, there is, I think just ruling out every nut crop because there might be a pest called a squirrel seems a bit hard on the nut trees. And considering all around the world there are really serious pests who kind of people have managed to, through necessity, to keep out of their crops, I think a little bit more creativity could probably mean we could grow the crop.
And what's the plan for the nuts?
What's the plan for the nuts? At the moment, I would be interested in just selling them fresh, as fresh in shell. If squirrels did prove to be a horrendous problem, I could sell them as green for pickling, and there is actually quite a high demand for small green walnuts for pickling for the one company that does it. They currently import quite a few of them. And then again, if I'm keen to look at other areas, I want to plant some sweet chestnut trees, which I've got grafted at the moment. And I think if we can get lots of other areas of trees planted and managed by groups of people, maybe as a collective we can buy some processing equipment and then look at developing things like walnut oils or butters and having slightly more higher value products. But yeah, probably for the first short time I won't be having huge yields, so I'll stick with the fresh and shell market.
Have you got any wisdom about allelopathy?
Allelopathy. From what I've gleaned from the person doing some research in Ireland, the juggalo is much higher in the black walnut species, and in the jugular regia, the kind of English walnut, they do have the juggalo, but it's not at such a high concentration, and the concentration kind of increases as the trees get older. So he kind of, and there's certain species which the juggalo is most kind of effective against, things like apples in theory, and Solanaceae, and there's a kind of a list of species which the juggalo is supposed to kind of directly affect. So I think it'd probably be wise not to do an alley cropping system with the walnuts right next to a kind of a thing which is particularly sensitive. But I think also in the short term it's probably not likely to have a huge effect because he's growing apple trees and walnuts in a nursery bed next to each other, and he said there's been no difference in growth in any of the apples growing next to walnuts as to growing next to any other tree, and that's for trees up to 3 or 4 years. So in the early years, apparently, there hasn't been a noticeable effect.